Hey, Margie here. I'm often asked, does it matter if I eat organic when it comes to the health of my bones? And the answer is absolutely yes. And one of the reasons is because by eating organic, we can minimize our exposure to glyphosate. And glyphosate is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. And this is such an important topic that I wanted everybody to truly understand. So, today's podcast episode, I'm going to share an interview I did on my summit, Natural Approaches to Osteoporosis and Bone Health, with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. And Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Her recent interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis on the pervasive herbicide glyphosate and the mineral sulfur. Since 2008, she has authored over 3 dozen peer reviewed journal papers on these topics. She has published a book on glyphosate called Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And in this interview, she discusses the problems with glyphosate on our bones and what we can do. So I'm really excited to share this with you. And please take it seriously because I really believe this can make a big difference in your health. So stay tuned. So, for the discussion today, I thought it would be great to first give our audience some background on this topic. So, why don't we start with just what is glyphosate and why is it such a concern for our overall health and our bones as well?
Okay, glyphosate is the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide Roundup, which most people know what Roundup is. They can go buy it at the garden store and use it to kill the dandelions in their yard. Glyphosate is a very wonderful weed killer in the sense that it kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it. So it goes hand in hand with the GMO technology, and many of the core crops have been engineered with a genetic insertion of a bacterial gene to be able to resist glyphosate. So you can spray it all over the crop and it doesn't die. That's been a great boon for agriculture, and it's made our food cheap. So we have, massive amounts we have these huge fields of corn and soy, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, cotton. These are all GMO Roundup-ready crops. And the products go directly into the processed food industry. So you end up with a lot of glyphosate in the foods that are derived from those crops. Worse than that, it's also sprayed right before harvest on many non-GMO crops. So many people think, oh, non-GMO, I'm safe, I'll buy that. Not true at all. In fact, the highest levels of glyphosate are being found in foods that are derived from legumes like chickpeas and garbanzo beans. So, for example, hummus, and also oats and wheat. All of those are sprayed, and also sugarcane. They're all sprayed right before harvest with glyphosate in order to kill the crop. So it's intentionally to kill it. It makes it go to seed, so it increases the yield. It synchronizes the yield. It might be running against a frost, so you're going to want to harvest early before the cold sets in. So there's all these reasons why it's a good idea to do this. But the bad idea is that it ends up at high concentration in those foods. And many of those foods are very popular among children.
So let's just repeat this for a minute, because I think for some people listening, this is shocking that, you see the label non-GMO and you think that's the only problem with glyphosate because they've been engineered to take on more glyphosate. Like, they could get more of the Roundup-ready. But what you're saying is also as a desiccant. So they're spraying. So all wheat let's differentiate. So if it's organic, this can't happen. Is that correct?
They can't spray it right before harvest. It can still have glyphosate in it because it's in the rain. It's going to be in the water supply, probably in the manure. So you can't avoid glyphosate pretty much in this country because it's pervasive, but much lower levels and sometimes zero in organic foods. They
Right.
sometimes test positive, but it's usually small levels.
Okay. So would that be your number one tip so far?
He's certified organic. We're obsessed on it, and when we go shopping, we always look for the certified organic label. If we can't find it, we don't buy it.
And I just think that's fascinating that something could say non-GMO or non-GMO soy. If you look at the ingredient level, you can see the GMO certified label, but yet it can have glyphosate because it's sprayed on the wheat, as you said, and some of the legumes if they're non-organic. Okay. Tip. That's a fabulous tip and something that really can be life-changing. But let's go into why it's so damaging? Because I know there's a huge relationship and you've done so much research. I just have to thank you and commend you because it's not that you're just saying these things. You have researched this more than anyone, I think. I mean, it's so impressive what you've done, and thank you for your contribution. But let's talk about the gut because there's a huge relationship between glyphosate and the gut, as well as gut health and bone health. So why don't you fill us in on this?
Very interesting, actually. And I have a chapter in my book on the gut. And I really spent a long time working on that chapter, had to read a lot of papers. Some of them were unintelligible. I mean, there's so much information on the gut, it gets overwhelming. But I finally did kind of build a story around glyphosate in the gut that I feel makes a lot of sense. And the first thing is that it kills bacteria. It's actually been patented as an antimicrobial agent. It kills bacteria. And it kills in particular the beneficial bacteria, preferentially kills them. Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria are very sensitive to glyphosate. So when you're getting exposed chronically to glyphosate, they deplete in numbers and they get injured and then they can't do their job. So lots of things go bad. And one of the things that those two microbes do is to promote the uptake of minerals into the body across the gut barrier. So calcium, phosphorus, manganese, magnesium, they're all going to be depleted of course, magnesium and calcium and phosphate are all really important for the bones, and they're not going to be able to come in at adequate levels. So that's going to affect the bones. Number two is really interesting, and I really found this super fascinating as I read different papers and connected some dots. Glyphosate increases the pH of the colon. The acidity, the acid-base balance goes up towards basic in the colon in response to glyphosate. That's been shown in studies. And then other studies have shown that when the pH is too high, the gut microbes don't make enough short chain fatty acids. And the short chain fatty acids are very, very important for bone health. They actually suppress these osteoclasts that break down bone. So that's another part of that issue.
That's huge, actually.
I think so. Yeah. The short chain fatty acids are really fascinating. And I learned a lot about them in writing my book, and I'm still studying them because there's an imbalance as well as too low, too few altogether. And those are produced out of foods that we eat, like fiber, that we can't digest. Our cells don't know how to digest them. They get into the gut, lower gut, and then the bacteria break them apart, turn them into these wonderful, highly nutritious short chain fatty acids. And there are too few of them if you're being chronically exposed to glyphosate.
Wow, I had no idea. I knew glyphosate did a lot of things, but I didn't realize that it actually depleted the short chain fatty acids. Wow. Okay, continue on this. Lovely. Can I just say something that's so unbelievable for everybody listening is that you could just go down to your local garden store and buy glyphosate. Am I correct about that? You can just buy it without any warning.
Unregulated.
That this could be destroying the health of America, or this could be destroying your health. And there's no warning label.
The health of America,
right?
In my opinion.
It's just,
and I do want to say that we've been taught that it's beautiful herbicide, perfectly safe for humans, like aspirin, perfectly safe, wonderful. Don't worry about it. Oh yeah, it's in the food. We don't care. The government doesn't even measure to find out how much is in the food. It's through activists that we've learned that it's contaminating the food. The government doesn't care because they've bought into the false statement that it's safe. And I know it's not safe. And in fact, I believe it's, the primary factor behind the autism epidemic. And that's a lot of what my book talks about. And we're not going to talk about that today, but that's where I started. And I believe if we were to switch to certified organic across the country and get rid of the glyphosate, autism rates would go down, I think, dramatically.
Wow. So let's go back to the gut. I'm sorry. I just found that so interesting with the short chain fatty acids. So continue on the gut.
Yeah, well, those were the 2 points I wanted to make about the gut. We maybe can go on to the next.
Okay. So the other thing that's really interesting is you propose a plausible mechanism, which by glyphosate really is a threat to health. So can you just share that because it's so interesting?
That's the most, that's the most fascinating part about glyphosate. And that's what really got me engaged once I realized that, because I knew it was a glycine. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. Glycine is the smallest amino acid. And the amino acids are the building blocks of protein. They're the famous DNA code, the Watson-Crick DNA code with the 4 letters. Those letters code for the amino acids. And it's about 20 amino acids. And they are lined up like beads on a string, according to the code, to make the proteins. And the proteins are the workhorses of the body. They're super, super important. And so glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except that it's lost one of its hydrogen atoms and it's been replaced by something called a methylphosphonate unit. So it's got this extra piece of stuff sticking off the nitrogen atom, but the rest of it's intact. And that means it matches. In places where glycine needs to fit inside a pocket in an enzyme, it matches. And that's what becomes very, very dangerous, because the enzymes that are involved in making proteins, according to the DNA code, can screw up. They can choose glyphosate where they should have chosen glycine. They can insert glyphosate into the protein by mistake. And this can have devastating consequences on certain proteins. So that became a really fun puzzle to try to figure out, because I'm looking at diseases that are going up exactly in step with glyphosate, proteins that are affecting those diseases. Which, if a protein has a glycine mutation, it causes that disease. That protein would then be susceptible to glyphosate. And I can even look at the surrounding environment to see if it predicts a very comfortable place for glyphosate to fit, because you've got to have room for that extra stuff on the nitrogen atom. So you need to have small amino acids nearby. Nice to have a positively charged one to attract the negative charge of glyphosate. There's certain rules of chemistry that can predict which proteins would be most likely to get the substitution. And then you look at which proteins have highly conserved glycines that are essential for them to work. For example, myosin, and that's another one for the gut, actually. Myosin is a muscle contractile protein, very, very important in the gut for peristalsis, to move the tissues, the feces through. And the myosin has 11 highly conserved glycine residues. And one in particular, there was an article about it. If you switch it out for alanine, which is a minimal change, just one extra methyl group, it ruins it. It can only contract at like 1 or 2% of capacity. So you start throwing glyphosate into the myosin molecules in the gut, the gut's not going to be able to contract. And in fact, it's been shown. There was a study where a woman tried to commit suicide by drinking a glyphosate containing formulation, and her gut got paralyzed by that. So it's sort of partially paralyzing your gut when you're getting the exposure from your food, and that's causing the things to back up, and then you get small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and stuff like that.
I was just thinking about that motility. That's such a problem with the gut, that there's just reduced peristalsis, like you're saying, the movement. So how interesting that it could be a root cause of that, the glyphosate. Wow, so fascinating.
Yes.
Is there anything else with the glycine that we'll see?
There will be, if we continue with the next question, because I can get into how that affects the bones.
Okay, so let's go to the bones. Okay,
yeah.
So this is natural approaches to bone health. And good news is there are things that can be done. So keep listening. But let's talk about how that affects the bones and the joints actually as well.
It's quite interesting. For example, there's a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yes,
Osteogenesis
sure.
imperfecta. And that's caused by mutations in collagen, and in particular by glycine mutations in collagen. So you can guess where I'm going with this, because I believe that glyphosate is majorly messing up collagen. Collagen is an amazing molecule, and it's actually something like 20% of the body's proteins are collagen molecules. It's by far the most common protein in the body. It's a structural protein. Collagen is huge amounts of it in the bones, in the joints, in the skin. It's a structural protein, very important for the joints to maintain the proper, so they don't grind against each other. It traps water. It has good tensile strength and elasticity. It has a lot of properties that make it very, very effective in the bone and in the joints. So collagen is super, super important in the bones. And collagen has this long, long sequence of, like 100 long of GXY, 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 GXY. Every third amino acid is glycine. Huge richness of glycine in collagen. Many opportunities for glyphosate to mess it up. And there's many different glycines in the collagen molecule where the mutations and even just changing the glycine to alanine, again, that minimal change causes these diseases like this osteoporosis disease. So that's one, is collagen getting messed up by glyphosate. That's a really big one. And I think that's what's causing we have so many people who have issues with pain, bone pain, joint pain, back pain, knee surgery, hip surgery, all these problems with their bones that I think are connected to glyphosate messing up the collagen. But not only the collagen, but also sulfate. And I write a lot about sulfate in my book. That's something that I had zeroed in on early on with respect to autism. I understood that the autistic kids were having trouble with sulfate. They were not managing it correctly. In fact, they were flushing it through the urine. And so they would have low levels of sulfate in their blood. It depleted levels of sulfate in their blood, and they would be flushing it out through the urine. And interestingly enough, vitamin D is very important for sulfate. Vitamin D actually uh, changes the behavior of the kidneys so that they keep the sulfate and recirculate it back into the blood instead of sticking it out into the urine. So with adequate vitamin D, the kidneys conserve sulfate and bring it back around into the body. With insufficient vitamin D, they flush it. And then vitamin D deficiency is linked to autism. So that all connects up. How do you get glyphosate? Glyphosate suppresses enzymes in the liver called cytochrome P450 enzymes. And cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver and the kidney are essential for activating vitamin D. So, you can take vitamin D, but if you don't activate it, it's not going to work. And the one that we measure is the activated form after this liver enzyme, the CYP enzyme has done its job to modify the vitamin D. That's the one we measure. So if that enzyme is blocked, your vitamin D is going to be deficient. And I think we have we have an epidemic in vitamin D deficiency in our society right now. And lots of people are taking vitamin D supplements. Some of them still aren't getting their levels out. Glyphosate's messing up that process that makes the vitamin D work. And therefore, the sulfate gets flushed through the kidneys, and therefore the sulfate becomes deficient, and specifically becomes deficient in the bones. It's been shown in rat studies. They can rig them so they're deficient in vitamin D, and they will end up with deficiencies in chondroitin sulfate, which is a super important molecule in the bones for keeping them strong. So I think the sulfate system is getting messed up by glyphosate in a big way, and then that's causing the bone, also fragile bones. There's a brittle bone disease is that associated with, I have that written down here.
That's like
Brittle
an extreme, right? That's an extreme, but osteoporosis, when you're losing bone, the bones do become brittle and fracture, and that's a real problem. So all of these things, it's just extremes. It's just a matter of how much, but yeah, all of this absolutely can affect the integrity of our bones. And, we want strong, healthy bones that if we do fall, they're flexible and they have the good collagen and they have all the nutrients. So this is an absolutely huge topic. I just can't even get over how important it is, and yet something that's not even recognized. So
right. So then there's more with the sulfate, because there's a sulfotransferase. It's an enzyme that's very important for transferring sulfate. There's a molecule called PAPS, which is an activated sulfate molecule. It's got some ATP stuff on it to keep it so it can react easily. PAPS, it's the universal sulfate donor. It's called PAPS, phosphoadenoacyl phosphosulfate, I think is what it's called. It's a fascinating molecule, but that molecule is essential for transferring sulfate from one molecule to another, which of course is important to get the chondroitin sulfate. You've got to transfer the sulfate to the chondroitin. And all the enzymes, the sulfotransferases, they have a particular motif called the GXX-GXXK motif. And the G's are glycines. The K is actually lysine, which is not a very kind of a strange translation from K to lysine. They have these one-letter codes for the amino acids. G stands for glycine. So GXX-GXXK means a glycine, and a lysine with wild cards in between. They could be any amino acid. That's a pattern that you see in these sulfotransferases. And that pattern is the place where if you have a mutation, you end up with the sulfotransferase being completely disabled. And studies have shown that if you change one of those G's to an alanine, again, minimal change, the protein's dead. It can't do its job at all. It can't bind to the PAPS. And I talk a lot in my book about phosphate binding, and that's the critical thing. Places where proteins bind phosphate often have these critical glycine residues at those places. And the glyphosate substitutes for the glycine and blocks the place where the phosphate's supposed to go. This is a sort of a universal principle that I talk about in my book. And that's what goes on actually in the enzyme that glyphosate famously disrupts in the shikimate pathway in the plants, which is called EPSP synthase. EPSP synthase binds phosphate at a place where there's a highly conserved glycine that is getting substituted by glyphosate to mess that enzyme up. That's what I believe is happening.
Wow. So the good news is there's things that can be done. And I think that there are things everybody can do. So why don't you start telling us what everybody can do in terms of reducing our exposure to glyphosate, and there are things that can help us detoxify.
Right. Now, I already mentioned organic diet, certified organic. I think it's number one. I think if you start switching to certified organic, you're going to see improvements in your health in basic ways. Things like urinary tract infections will go away. I mean, I think just even simple annoyances that you're putting up with, you don't need to if you switch over to a certified organic diet. getting out in the sunlight, I think, is very, very important for the bones. And again, that's the vitamin D. I really believe in natural sources of vitamin D. And I also argue that sunlight is not just about vitamin D. I believe it. And I talk about it in my book. So sunlight catalyzes the synthesis of sulfate in the skin. And the vitamin D actually gets sulfated and gets shipped out into the blood as vitamin D sulfate. So the vitamin D is actually supplying sulfate to the body through that process. And the body is using the sun's energy to actually, it captures the energy of the sun via the sulfate molecule. So it's really, really beautiful biophysics that's going on there. And I think sun exposure is super, super important, not just to the skin, but also to the eyes. And I really don't think, I think it's, I feel very bad when I see a little 2-year-old wearing sunglasses. They need to have the sun exposure in their eyes. One of the problems is that glyphosate goes into the eyes and messes up the eye's ability to protect themselves from the sun. So it's a combination of glyphosate poisoning plus sunlight can damage your eyes. But if you don't have the glyphosate poisoning, sunlight is very healthy for the eyes, actually. I have never worn sunglasses. I don't wear glasses. I'm outside in the sun a lot, and I don't try to protect my eyes at all. And my eyes are great. I don't have cataracts. I don't have any issues with my eyes, which is pretty amazing because I know a lot of people, a lot of my friends my age have had cataract surgery, you know.
That is amazing. That's
Yeah.
I was one of those people that always wore sunglasses. And one of the speakers actually on the summit talks about natural approaches to eye care and in terms of how you can maintain your balance and depth perception. But she told me that is not healthy. So I really rarely wear them, and it changed my night vision. Everything improved. So I couldn't agree with you more. Okay, so continue.
You can market sunglasses, right? Whenever you have something you can sell, then you want to make sure people know that they need to use it. So that's how they make sales on these. They have these very fancy sunglasses that cost a lot of money, you know, and I think it's a mistake. So that's sunlight exposure. So for sulfate, I think soaking in Epsom salt baths, that's something that I advocate. And I do that frequently. Just throw a few, and I just use a little, like maybe a third of a cup of Epsom salt, throw it into the bath water, hot bath. It's very relaxing in the evening to take a hot bath before you go to bed, I feel, especially with a little sulfate in there.
So that's some magnesium. You're getting magnesium sulfate as well.
Magnesium is also very important for the bones, magnesium and sulfate. So that's important. And then for glyphosate, I talk about apple cider vinegar. I hope it's true, because I've been saying that apple cider vinegar has an enzyme in it, or a microbe in it that has an enzyme that's able to break down glyphosate enzymatically, which, if true, it would be really, really wonderful. You could even get it broken down while it's still in the mouth before it even gets to the stomach. The glyphosate could disappear if you've got the apple cider vinegar. So we actually have it pretty much every night before dinner. We have a salad. We put Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar, make a salad dressing out of that, put it on liberally on the lettuce, and have a salad every night. So I definitely believe in eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, I don't believe in vegan. So I think organic eggs are super good, and buy the highest quality eggs you can find. Very, very nutritious, lots of good minerals, because the minerals are so important for the bones. So I really, and the egg yolk in particular is very, very healthy. People get worried about cholesterol, which I think is stupid. I think cholesterol is actually good for you. And so eggs, seafood is also, I like nutrient dense food. So eating a lot of clams, oysters, scallops, all those seafoods are very, very healthy foods. And then, so fermented foods, of course, apple cider vinegar, meaning fermented foods, sauerkraut is good to have for the same reason. I think the sauerkraut could break down the glyphosate enzymatically as well.
You had a study in your book. You want to just quickly mention that about the sauerkraut juice? You had a study.
The cows. I know.
Yeah, that was so interesting.
That was what really tipped me off to the idea of the apple cider vinegar, actually, because that study, the cows are suffering. The cows have a lot of problems. And of course, the vets are trying to figure out how to fix that. And this paper was quite interesting, because these cows were sick and they tested glyphosate. They found it in their urine, high levels. And then they were like, how can we get it out? How can we fix these cows? And I don't know how they came up with this, but maybe because of just experience from other toxins, they thought of bentonite clay and fulvic acid, humic acid. So they used all of those things. Fulvic acid is a binder. I think it's good for removing toxins in general. And so potentially glyphosate. In fact, I learned from reading about fulvic acid that it actually traps enzymes. And there are enzymes in particular so it's in the soil, it's just like organic matter in the soil. And there are enzymes that get trapped in the fulvic acid that are very capable of a generic ability to break down chemicals. It's quite interesting. They're very versatile enzymes that can break down lots of things. And so they could also be breaking down glyphosate in the fulvic acid, but it also is apparently a binder. So it might bind to it and get it moved out through the feces. So fulvic acid, humic acid, they're kind of similar. And then bentonite clay, and then apple cider vinegar, sauerkraut. Those are the
Let's just
basic.
tell everyone it's not the sauerkraut you put on your hot dogs. It's a fermented sauerkraut either you make or you get in the refrigerator section. A lot of people
Right,
don't realize
and you can get that organic.
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
buy organic. Yes, that's right. Refrigerated organic sauerkraut, which we have tons of actually in our house. We eat it all the
Me
time. Just a
too.
little bit with
Every
dinner.
day I have some fermented veg. I'm big into that.
Yes,
Absolutely.
good fermented vegetables. Of course, that's helping to renew your gut microbiome as well, which is important. So
So
yeah,
what
so
a
it's
great
just
thing. It's
whole
such a
food.
win-win to whatever we're doing to rid the glyphosate is so healthy for our
I
whole
know.
body as well.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Some people, I guess, have trouble with the taste. And some people are sensitive, I guess, because of histamines, I think, right? To fermented foods. They can have histamine sensitivities, which I think are also due to glyphosate. So I've talked about that in my book as well.
For people that can't do that, what do you recommend? Do you recommend probiotics then?
Yeah, I don't, yeah, maybe, I don't know. I often recommend, and of course, there are people who have sulfur sensitivities as well. That's a common problem. Again, that's caused by glyphosate. And I talk about that in my book as well. Glyphosate disrupts the enzymes that convert inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur in the form of methionine. So this ends up with methionine deficiency, which actually ends up with glutathione deficiency as well. Glutathione gets hit hard by glyphosate. And as you probably know, glutathione is a really important antioxidant in the liver. And so in autism, it's low, and glyphosate lowers the levels of glutathione. And glyphosate also increases the ratio of oxidized to reduced glutathione. These have been shown in studies, and I can see why it would, given how much I understand that molecule. Too much oxidized glutathione, which is not going to protect you. It needs to be reduced in order to be protective.
It's so interesting. So people that are listening, though, in terms of testing, is it something that it's not routinely tested, glyphosate levels?
No, I think increasingly, naturopaths are starting to test for glyphosate in the urine, and there have been studies that have shown. I was actually really surprised that they could see in these studies a correlation between the glyphosate in the urine and some disease. And there was a study on fatty liver disease that showed that they had three groups: the no fatty liver disease, mild case, extreme case, three different groups of people, and they found statistically significant differences in the glyphosate in the urine among those three groups, among all three of them. So the lesser disease had less glyphosate statistically significantly than the extreme disease. And then the guys with the disease had more glyphosate than ones without the disease. Studies on rats have shown that glyphosate causes fatty liver disease even when it's exposed to the rats at levels below regulatory limits. So glyphosate is ruining the liver. I have a whole chapter on the liver in my book.
Yeah, your book's amazing.
Chapter on the liver.
but I'm just thinking for everyone, that it's such a great book. The fact that because we've met before and that was you're writing the book, but now to have all of this research in one place and you did just an amazing job really explaining everything. So people who want to can just delve in and really, really see that we're not making this up. This is serious and there's great research. But for people with osteoporosis or bone health, this really could be a root cause. And so so it's something actually to even speak to your physician about or someone who's following you, because you can get it tested. And are there certain levels now that they've established, which would be considered high glyphosate, medium glyphosate?
Yeah, well, basically, they're kind of learning the levels as they go along, because I think when you get a test back, you get sort of the range of results from the other people who've been tested by them. So they just have a sort of a range that they found and where you sit within that range. And that's how you can tell if you're on the low side or a high side. I got a test and I tested positive, which made me really angry because I've been eating certified organic for a long time. I still had glyphosate in my urine. Not much, but I had a measurable amount.
I guess that's sort of what you said before. It's everywhere. So it could be from another farm or it could be in the water, but we can only do what we can do. But there's a lot that we can. So if we can reduce it significantly, we'll make big changes in our health. And I know that's what you've seen from your research as well.
Absolutely. And I get email from people, and it's very gratifying. Like I even get email from someone who says, "Oh, I have this horrible problem. I don't know what to do. And I'm wondering if maybe glyphosate might be causing it." And I say, yes, it could very well be. And I recommend you go certified organic. And then a year later, they come back and say, my problem went away. I'm so amazed. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm getting stuff like that. So I really think it's critical. I think people don't have any clue. It's hard for people to wrap their brain around the idea that this thing could be so toxic because people trust the government. They think the EPA is actually looking after us, and they're not. I mean, it's become very clear to me. The EPA is looking after the industry, and something's going to have to be extremely toxic before they're going to do anything about it. I'm actually very discouraged about our governmental regulation and how much it's failing us. But people feel like, oh, well, if the government thinks it's safe, it must be safe. And that is the wrong way to look at it. Absolutely wrong. They're so bought that they are no longer protecting us from toxic chemicals, in my opinion. They're
And what about
failing in
other
their job.
countries? There are differences in the
They're
amount.
doing better. I mean, look at Mexico. I'm so excited. Mexico has said they're going to completely eliminate glyphosate by 2023. Completely eliminate it. And the US says, no, you can't do that. We're pressuring them. We're saying, we're going to not, we're going to boycott. We're not going to let you buy it. I mean, the US is spitting mad at them for doing this, which just really is frustrating. So our country is the bad guy. We use more glyphosate per person than any other country in the world. And I will say we have 4% of the world's population, 19% of the world's glyphosate. And I have a chapter on the immune system. Glyphosate is destroying our immune system, our innate immunity.
Wow. Well, this has been just incredible. Is there any last things that you want to leave everybody with? You've just shared so much good information. And I don't think anyone's listening saying, oh gosh, they don't see how this could be affecting their bones, and they're not going to.
I know, it's definitely good. And my bones are really strong. I don't have any aches and pains. I mean, I'm really pleased with my body. And I was worried about bone health because my mother and her sister both had severe osteoporosis. And I don't have any problem. My bones are strong. I had a bone density test done, and they were amazed at how good my bones were. So what I'm doing is working, and I've been into vitamin D long before I was into organic food. So getting out in the sun, eating certified organic. If you do those two things alone, I think you're going to have good bone health. And of course, spread the word, help, tell your family, tell your friends, get people on board with this idea that glyphosate is toxic. And it needs to be banned worldwide. There are many countries that are moving towards banning it. The United States is definitely not one of them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We spend so much money on so many different things, and something as simple as banning glyphosate. I guess it's not that simple, but if we did that, just think of all the amazing health consequences, the positive health consequences.
Right. And there are many people who are working on how to grow certified organic food economically and efficiently. And that's going to be important too. Part of the thing is robotics. And I'm quite fascinated with the work that's going on in robotics to build these, they can be solar powered tractors that can go out and use vision to recognize weeds and then use safe methods to kill them.
Wow.
I think that's going to be the future, that if we can find a way to design equipment that can efficiently remove weeds without actually using toxic chemicals. That's the key, I think.
That sounds great. Well, we could talk for so many hours because I love talking to you. You're so fascinating. You're just full of amazing information. But thank you so much for being here today. So where can people learn more about you?
Yeah, and there's my book, Toxic Legacy. Read this book.
So
That's got
good.
a ton of references in there too. So you can become an expert on glyphosate if you go after those references. And then my webpage, StephanieSeneff.net, is my webpage, and I've got links to various interviews and papers and stuff on my webpage. And then I have also an MIT webpage, which is a much more complicated name, but you can find my MIT webpage from my StephanieSeneff.net. So that's probably the best.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. And if you value this information, please share it. Share with a friend and really take the advice that Dr. Seneff gave everyone, because it's so important for both your overall health and your bones. And we want to have happy bones because happy bones create a happy life. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Seneff as much as I did, and now have a better understanding of why glyphosate can be so damaging to our bones and why, whenever possible, we should choose organic. So all the links that Dr. Seneff talked about will be in the show notes, as well as the link to my free Improve Your Bone Health Naturally mini course, which gives you so much information on how you can get started on your path to optimal bone health. So you can find that in the show notes. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.